Hi there, it's Matt here, and welcome back to the podcast, and welcome back to another of those AMA episodes, Ask Me Anything episodes. And what's wonderful is that I am again joined by the bright, the dazzling, the flashing, the radiant, the scintillating, sparkling, vivid, the gleaming, the illustrious individual called Dr. Etty Ben Simone. Etty, welcome back to the show.
I'm a Broadway musical by now. Happy to be here.
You know, if you've got that talent, I've never seen it in lab meeting, but,
I'm
open
working
up
on
your
it.
lungs, bang out a couple of show tunes for us. We'd love it. Okay, so why don't we just dig straight into the first question?
The first question is about power naps. What do you say about their optimal length and timing and just overall benefits?
Ooh, good question. And I did do an episode a while back. I think it was called something crass because I named it, which was like the art of napping or something, or optimal napping. But again, folks can check that out. But here is the TLDR, sort of too long, didn't read. Give me the cliff notes. What's the high level summary? Overall, lots of people, including ourselves, have done lots of studies on naps. And sure enough, naps of different durations can offer some really great benefits. I will come on to the reason why they could be a double-edged sword. But perhaps they're a double-edged sword for not just one reason, which is maybe a more serious one, which is if you're suffering from insomnia, why you should not be napping during the day. But the inherent danger that comes with napping called sleep inertia. And sleep inertia, most people will know of this. It's that sort of slightly groggy, almost sleep hangover effect that you get when you take a nap, and maybe it's a nap that's quite long or maybe even longer than you anticipated. And you wake up, and in that first sort of 15 or 20 minutes, you almost feel worse than you did before the nap. And we have to keep this thing called sleep inertia in mind. If the question, as I heard the question was about the optimal length or maybe optimal timing. I can't quite remember what the question was, but
Both.
Okay. So yeah, the optimal length and timing of a nap. I think timing is usually pretty clear. I think you would probably want to be napping sometime in the early middle afternoon. You don't want to time that nap too late in the afternoon, and certainly not in the evening. The reason is because napping at that later stage in the day is a little bit like snacking before your main meal, that it will take the sleep appetite, hunger out of your brain, so that when it comes time for your main meal at your standard bedtime, your main meal of sleep, you're just not going to feel as hungry anymore. So make sure that you're aware of trying to cut yourself off from napping after a certain time. But that's about the timing. It doesn't tell you about duration. What is optimal? Well, when people say what is optimal, I think they're really saying the main goal of napping is usually to enhance brain function. For most people, the reason that they're going to nap is not because they say, gosh, my body is just so tired, but my mind is fine, but I still know my body needs a nap. Most people say, I need a nap, meaning I think my brain needs a nap because I'd like to restore some of my alertness. I'd like to restore some of my focus. Maybe even I'd like to boost my mood a little bit and improve my memory. So what you have to understand is that across those studies, on average, the longer that you nap, the greater the degree of the benefit for those types of functions, but also the greater number of functional benefits that you will get. So in that case, then, why aren't I saying have nice, long naps? Well, there's a trade-off, and it comes back to sleep inertia, that essentially there is a sort of a dose-response relationship where the longer the nap, yes, the greater the overall benefits on average. And again, I'm just, summarizing here. And I went into detail into very specific studies in that episode. But the longer the nap, the more of those benefits that you get. And of those benefits, the greater the size of those benefits and the more reliable. The problem is that the longer you nap, the higher the probability is that you will suffer from sleep inertia. And the longer and the more intense the sleep inertia will be when you wake up from the longer nap. And it turns out that we and others have done these studies where you do that essentially like a drug, what we call a dose response curve. I give you a certain dose and I look at the benefit and I look at the cost. And then we go up in terms of the dose and look at the cost and the benefit. And here, the dose is the duration of the nap. So maybe 5 or 6 overview points. Let's move through the different doses. Dose number 1, ultra short naps, 5 minutes. Some people say that's just enough for me. I kind of get a little bit of a reset. In truth, if you look at the data, on average across those studies, there is upside number 1, no evidence of sleep inertia. You wake up after a 5-minute nap and you typically don't have any sleep inertia. The problem is you get very little brain benefit. Okay, so next dose, that's the 10-minute dose of nap. And here the data demonstrates some really quite nice but modest improvements in your basic response time. So your speed of response is better and your ability to concentrate on material is better. And those last for a couple of hours. And you also typically don't have too much inertia, the downside, after a 10-minute nap. But after that basic response time and some improvements in your concentration, there weren't many other cognitive benefits. Okay, next dose, longer nap at 15 minutes. Now, what we find are really quite robust and significant benefits to your alertness. So you feel more alert. You've got greater concentration and focus. There are also some benefits for problem solving ability. You seem to be more efficient. Your brain has greater alacrity with which it can solve those problems. There is a slight downside that you will get some sleep inertia after a 15-minute nap. But the good thing is that that sleep inertia dissipates quite quickly, goes away. And what it's replaced by are those nice enhanced brain functions that I described just a second ago. Next dose, 20 minutes. Now we get even more significant benefits for your alertness. We also get some added additional cognitive benefits. Things such as your ability to learn fresh, new information has improved after the nap. Your ability to have saved the memories that you've been learning before the nap, they've been now consolidated. The downside is, again, you now have slightly longer sleep inertia still. So you're going to have to suffer through a little bit more of that grogginess. But again, it's replaced by even more of those benefits, and those benefits are even more robust and significant. Then let's go to 30 minutes. And now, yes, you still continue to get lots of those nice cognitive and even some mood benefits. But the problem is that you will take almost as much time to get back up to speed in terms of your brain functioning and those benefits going beyond where you were at baseline that it took you to nap. So in other words, you may still have 30 minutes of sleep inertia to get through after about a 30-minute nap. Sometimes that can be even longer. And why is this the case, by the way, when you sort of do 30 minutes or more? Well, the problem is that sleep inertia is really starting to kick in hard when you go from the lighter stages of non-REM sleep down into those deeper stages of non-REM sleep. And when you wake up from those very deep stages of sleep that you can get to after about 30 minutes, it's almost as though your brain never really expects that, never goes through that. And you're getting wrenched from the basement all the way up to the penthouse of wakefulness, but you kind of get sort of wedged somewhere in the middle, and it's just miserable. Your brain's not quite functioning well. And so that's the only downside. So I think what I would say is that overall, the optimal time to nap is somewhere in the early to middle afternoon and no later. I would then say the optimal length of nap and optimal for what most people I think are meaning optimal is somewhere between about 10 to 20 minutes. Longer naps can be beneficial, yes, but they do come with that downside of greater sleep inertia to overcome. But if you're willing to overcome it, then you do get a return on the longer nap investment. A supporter of today's podcast is Magic Spoon. I have had a love affair with cereal for most of my life, but when I started to sort of focus on wellness and health, I realized that most cereals, they were just really unhealthy, so I stopped eating them and life was much more miserable. And then my friend, Dr. Peter Attia, introduced me to a company called Magic Spoon. Magic Spoon is a fantastic cereal company. You can check them out. They have really healthy, high-protein cereal. Magic Spoon, in addition to their cereals, they have now introduced Magic Spoon treats, and I have certainly added them into my panoply of things that I enjoy eating and that I use in terms of my fitness routines. They've got 11 grams of protein, just 1 gram of sugar, just 4 net carbs per bar. And they're just really well balanced if you're looking for this type of thing. There's tons of flavors to choose from: chocolate, peanut butter, blueberry, double chocolate, hashtag my favorite, strawberry milkshake, you name it, they've got it. Magic Spoon treats are available at your nearest grocery store. You can find them online. If you're looking for a healthy, fueling snack, I would suggest checking them out. For folks listening to this podcast, you can actually get $5 off your next order. Just go over to magicspoon.com/Matt Walker. And as I said, you will get $5 off there. Let's get back to the show now. So it turns out that NASA figured this out many years ago in terms of NASA nap performance. They were looking at their astronauts and how to maintain astronaut performance. Because if you have a job like mine and you make a mistake during the day, maybe I have a few grammatical errors when I'm writing a grant, it's not great, but it's not catastrophic. But you make an error if you're on the space station, and that can be dramatically significant. And they were playing around with studying naps. And in fact, that they found that naps of somewhere between 20 to 30 minutes provided about a 34% improvement in alertness and about a 50% improvement in task performance on the experimental tasks that they were doing. And it was so powerful in the astronauts that it birthed what was then called the NASA nap culture in almost all of the terrestrial employees of NASA, which I kind of love. In fact, I think some of those studies were conducted, which brings me on to the second point. Have you ever wondered where this term power naps come from? There were two great scientists, Mark Rosekine and David Dinges, both titans in the field. And way back in the 1980s, they were doing work for the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, the sort of flight authority here in America. And they were saying, look, on these long-haul flights, we want to be thoughtful of the pilots, because often when we have most of the accidents is coming into landing on these long-haul flights. That's where the highest error rate can be. So how do we protect against that? What if we were to allow these pilots to be napping during the long-haul flight? Find out, if you can, sleep scientists, when is the optimal time to nap? Is it early in the flight or is it late in the flight? And I would have thought it would be late in the flight. In fact, what they found was that if you nap early in the flight, you sort of build up a little bit of sleep credit. It's like sleep banking. And then you don't suffer as much of a debt when you're spending that credit by staying awake for longer. So it's very interesting. So they reported their findings to the FAA, and they said, this is what we found. We think we should advocate for it. And because those naps are happening early and they're protective, we suggest the phrase prophylactic napping. Now, there were lots of chuckles in the room, prophylactics, and they said, look, great findings, but that phrase isn't going to fly. Now, this is sort of the story in the sleep annals. And they all got together, these, I suppose at the time, probably largely a male organization, lots of very strong headed males. Some people will call them alpha males. And they said, no, we're not going to do prophylactic napping. We're going to call it power napping. Much more sort of masculine fitting with us. So that was the term. That's the history of it.
I have to say, the last time I took a flight a few weeks ago, and it was delayed by an hour. And the reason was that the flight team did not have the mandatory time needed to rest. That's what it said in the text.
Yeah.
Like, okay, I don't want to interfere with that. I'm going to wait.
Isn't that great? And it's these studies that have tried to, lots of studies by people like that, that have really implemented those. I will say that whenever I make the cardinal mistake of when the person next to me in the plane seat says, "What do you do?" I can't lie. I don't lie very well. I'm a good liar, and so I have to say, yeah, despite wanting to say I'm a dolphin trainer, I end up saying yes, I'm a sleep
I'm
scientist.
not sure that would have ended up with
Yeah,
less
it's
questions,
probably
by the way.
yeah, or maybe I should say I work for the bovine insemination unit,
Oh my
and
God.
then yeah, sort of straight up no bull. But anyway, the idea then happens in the minds of the cabin crew because they hear me talking about sleep, and then they will pin you to the wall for the entire flight asking about sleep. So I asked them to say, what is your downtime? What's the mandatory rest time? And it's good that they have this in place, but if you listen to how much time that they actually have, it sounds like maybe you get at least 9 hours before you have to engage in the next round of your shift. And you think, well, maybe you only need somewhere between 7 to 8 hours a night. That's plenty. These people have got to get off the plane, then they've got to get the transport, get to the hotel, unpack. They've got to try to have some food. They've got to try to wind down. And then they've got to wake up in the morning, they've shower, dress, get back in the transportation, get to the airport on time through security. All of a sudden, there's no way that they're getting
Mhm.
still anything like sufficient sleep in terms of the cabin crew or the pilots. So it still remains, in my mind, a non-trivial issue. But again, I'm on my soapbox and I should get off it. So
I think that I want the people taking care of my flight to be as well rested as possible. It's
same with
everyone's.
my, physicians or doctors,
Exactly.
as I said, if I have an appendicitis at 3 a.m. in the morning, I am firstly so grateful that anyone is willing to work a night shift. Thank you. Thank you. My goodness for those medical staff and doctors. But I also would really like to hope and know that my surgeon has had at least 7 hours of sleep in the previous 24 before they start opening me up.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really in everyone's benefit that we appreciate, acknowledge, even pay extra for what these people are sacrificing
And
for a lot of us.
And I know that people will bristle, and rightly so, that medical costs are already so high. And they are, and I'm not going to go into that argument. But what I would say is this from my own personal perspective, if I have just come out of surgery and there's been a surgical error caused by that surgeon because they are unslept, because we're not paying enough doctors to get trained to distribute the work evenly. As I'm sitting there now in bed with a terrible infection, or I've got an artery that has been nicked and I've got a much longer recovery because of that complication due to a surgical error, and someone were to come back to me and say, look, would you mind paying X amount more per year for your health insurance to now at this point have all of those problems removed and have had the operation go very smoothly and you're back to fitness in just 2 weeks' time, I would pay them considerably more money. And so that's the way I often think about those equations. I don't think about it in terms of prospection. Do I want to pay it just to prevent that? I think about it in retrospection, which is, okay, let's go through that scenario. If that has happened, looking back, would I be sad that I didn't make the choice to pay more for those more doctors to get trained and more coverage to be made? I think I would. So anyway,
Yeah.
less about me. I'm not making about me and my choices and my opinions. We should probably go to the next question.
Before we go to the next question, I think people would love to hear about people sometimes combine coffee with naps. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I do. And in fact, I did a whole episode called The Caffeine Nap. And it's a real thing, or some people call it a nappuccino. And the reason is that when people drink
That sounds
coffee,
cute.
doesn't it just, it sounds like a Disney character. When people drink coffee first thing in the morning, they say, "Look, darling, I'm sorry. I know I kind of left the kitchen in a state last night. Just let me just have a couple of sips of coffee and I'll be just fine. I'll be my better version of self." And after about 2 or 3 minutes, they say, "Oh, okay, now I'm good. I'm up to speed. I'm up and running." That's actually nonsense. The peak plasma concentration of caffeine doesn't hit until about somewhere between 9 to 12 or 14 minutes later. So, whatever benefit you're feeling is either placebo, or it's probably more likely that you're drinking your coffee hot. And when we warm the core of our body up, we improve our alertness. You have to warm up to wake up. And the benefit that you get initially is one of a thermal benefit, because that can happen within the time frame of just a few minutes. But I'm sort of going aside. I told you that the peak caffeine concentration kicks in at around somewhere between 9 to 14 minutes, depending on the study. Why is this relevant to the nappuccino or the caffeine nap? Well, what people do is that they get themselves tucked into bed. And sometimes I've used this with professional athletes too. And I don't use it as a standard. I don't recommend it as a standard, but in certain circumstances, you can use it. And you get yourself ready for your nap, get your room dark, you're dressed in whatever you're going to dress in. And just before you tuck yourself into bed, you have a quick espresso shot or two, and then you turn the light out and you put your eye mask on, your earplugs in, and off you go. And you time your clock for maybe 20 or so minutes, and take you a few minutes to drift off, so you get about 15 minutes of a nap. And I told you that after about 15 minutes you will get some sleep inertia, which you prefer to avoid. But what's great is that just as the sleep inertia is about to kick in when you're about to wake up, that's now when the peak of the plasma concentration of caffeine is kicking in. So it ejects you out of the nap with this caffeine hit, and you overcome what would naturally otherwise be a slight downside of the inertia. But
Mm,
the caffeine overcomes that inertia. So you get the benefits of the nap without the downside of the sleep inertia. And that's the caffeine nap.
I see. Fascinating. I'm going to dream about a Disney character called Nappuccino. No doubt.
Yeah, I'm sure maybe I can convince Pixar. I've done a few films with them before, and they are very good at. I'll describe that in the
Yeah.
next brainstorming meeting that we have with them. A sponsor of today's podcast is BetterHelp. As someone who has dedicated several decades now looking at the relationship between sleep and mental health, I know scientifically taking care of your mind is just as crucial as taking care of your body. It's the foundation of everything that we do with our minds, not to mention that your sleep health and your mental health are so powerfully intertwined. You can't have one without the other. Therapy can be an incredibly powerful way to support that foundation of mental health. This is where BetterHelp comes into play. I see it for anyone who wants to grow or learn and really just become the best version of their mental health selves. If you have been considering therapy, BetterHelp offers a flexible, convenient way to start. It's entirely online. You can fit it into your schedule no matter how busy you are. All you need to do, fill out a questionnaire, and you'll be matched with a licensed therapist who is right for you. You can switch therapists at any time without any additional charge. I think that's really important too. It's all about finding the right connection with your therapist. Please visit betterhelp.com/Matt Walker, and you will get 10% off your first month. Thanks again to BetterHelp for supporting this podcast and the sleep education mission that we are on. I'm really proud to support them. I think mental health and therapy is just an incredibly powerful, underutilized tool. So again, betterhelp.com/Matt Walker.
All right, our next question is about sleep disorders. We actually haven't talked a lot about these, so I really appreciate this question. It's about sleepwalking and the potential dangers of sleepwalking.
Oh, good question. And I am glad that we bring this topic up. Sleepwalking is also known as somnambulism, is our fancy phrase in medicine and sleep science. And it's a phenomena it's really intrigued scientists, doctors, and even the general public for many centuries. Sleepwalking or somnambulism is actually one of a broader blanket term set of sleep disorders that we call parasomnias. And para simply means it's abnormal behaviors that occur during or around sleep. Sort of para, when someone says, I'm going to paraphrase it, you're sort of just giving the rough, a roundabout overview. Parasomnia, these things that happen in and around sleep, is the kind of vague etymology. And sleepwalking is characterized by usually a complex set of behaviors. Why does this happen? Well, it happens usually not from dreaming. That's the first big surprise for most people. They will think, well, this person got up, they were muttering to themselves, they walked over to the refrigerator, they opened it, they got a glass of water, they put it to their lips, they put it back down, they left the refrigerator door open, they started walking back up the stairs. That all seems as though you would think the person is dreaming of getting a glass of water, so they get up and they go and do it. It's not true. Most of these sleepwalking events will happen from the very deepest stages of deep non-REM sleep. And that's usually the most dreamless probable stage of sleep. So, what happens, for reasons that we can't quite understand, is that something triggers the brain to wake up. And this actually is a much better use of the metaphor where the brain is trapped down in the basement and you get a call to go up to that penthouse suite. But now you get trapped on the 13th floor and everything gets a little bit wacky on the 13th floor. And that's where sleepwalking and sleep talking, sleep texting, sleep eating, sleep sexting, all of these things are part of these parasomnias. And sleepwalking is one of the many of these parasomnias. Parasomnias being the blanket umbrella term, and nested within that are sleepwalking, sleep talking, sleep texting, all of these things. Let me speak about prevalence and demographics. Sleepwalking, as probably parents will know, is much more common in children than adults. And the highest prevalence of sleepwalking typically occurs, if you look at the data, it's probably somewhere between about age 3 and age 7. And it sounds low, but it's actually quite high. About 1 to 5% of children will engage in some form of sleepwalking. And that decreases with frequency as the age of the individual increases. So the older that they get, the less and less this is going to happen. And so once you get to the adult population, we go from sort of 1 to 5%, and you can think about the average there, to maybe just 1 to 2% of the population. At least that's what I read. And actually, I'm probably a little bit out of date. I haven't checked. It's probably about 2016, 18 or something when I last read the papers on the demographic stats. What are the causes and the risk factors? Well, I just mentioned the underlying mechanism. It's a sort of the brain gets a jolt and it tries to wake up from deep sleep, which is something that's very abnormal, very rare, but not necessarily to be too concerned about. And I'll come onto that in a second. But what are the causes? The exact cause of sleepwalking is not really fully understood as to why people are sleepwalkers. I've just mentioned the mechanisms of how it happens, when it happens, but in general, why are you someone who is a sleepwalker? As I said, it seems to be multiple factors, but we don't fully understand it. It's a combination of genetics, environmental things, and developmental components. Certainly, other things can contribute. If you are sleep deprived, or a child is sleep deprived, haven't been getting their sleep, they have an increased probability of sleepwalking. So if an event has happened and you're a parent, think about, have they not been getting enough sleep more recently that you've noticed? We also note that when there is an infection and a child is in fever or an adult is in fever, they will have a higher probability of a sleepwalking event. There are certain medications that you can check, and I don't have a long list of those to memory now, but those can increase the likelihood of sleepwalking episodes. And as I said, there is some genetic component. We know that there is a family history of sleepwalking. So, in other words, if one or both of your parents were sleepwalkers as adults or children, then you will be at a higher genetic predisposition. I've already mentioned the types of behaviors that happen. People will sit up on the edge of a bed, they'll walk around. Some of the concerns here are, of course, that people, children included, will leave the house. Some adults will even drive, and there's been lots of documented cases of those. The behavior looks very strange because that person will be quite alarming to you. They will usually have a very blank face. They will be staring out almost into the distance, and they are relatively unresponsive to other people. If you try to communicate with them, they typically don't communicate back. And when they wake up or you gradually rouse them, they typically don't remember the episode. And in fact, this is a good demonstration of why it's not coming from REM sleep, from dream sleep. Once they wake up and you were to say, look, I know you don't remember anything of what you were doing there, but just tell me, before I woke you up, what was going through your mind? And they'll still say, nothing. There's just literally nothing going through my mind. And that's because there wasn't, because they weren't dreaming. They were just in this automatic state of performing very routinized, very rote behaviors, like walking around, like picking up a glass, like walking out the door.
There are
Um,
some documents of someone frying their socks.
Frying their socks, really?
Yeah, I think they were probably thinking they're making breakfast, but they were frying their socks.
I only hope in that scenario they
That
were
it's
clean
cleansy.
socks. Yeah, because to add insult to injury, clean fried cotton is probably not the greatest tasting thing, but unclean fried foot
Wow,
cotton,
that should
yeah,
have woken
okay.
them up, right?
Oh my goodness, yeah. If that doesn't rouse you out of your sleep, I don't know what will. Even just the smell of it. Aside from that potential danger, what are some of the other more perhaps real dangers? Well, they can pose various risks. Individuals may be inadvertently harming themselves. They can be tripping, falling. If they're running into objects, obviously that's not good. More serious incidents, if people leave the house and they're driving while asleep, clearly not good. Lots of significant harm happens there. Legal consequences, of course. There have been some very rare cases of dangerous violent behaviors in the literature. Those are very, very uncommon, though, so please don't get anxious or worried about that. Diagnosis, I would say, typically it doesn't involve a sleep study, although it can, but it can be so rare that it's sort of hard to capture, as it were, by just 1 or 2 nights of sleep recording. But if someone is doing it frequently, you can capture it that way. Usually it involves just a very careful medical and sleep history. But there are sometimes tools like sleep recordings, polysomnography that can be helpful, particularly if it's a very complex case of sleepwalking. We can also do something called actigraphy, which is essentially like a movement wristwatch, and also do video recordings to document those in the home, obviously with patient consent. The treatment that is there in the literature, it doesn't usually require any significant intervention as long as the condition is not necessarily causing too much harm. It's mostly considered to be a benign condition, but treatment often involves, for children and adults, just making sure everything is safe in the environment and minimizing those triggers. I told you things like sleep deprivation and fever, also stress. Try to minimize those to minimize the triggers of making it happen. Also, then the consequences, making sure the environment is safe. So, in other words, securing the environment, locking doors, locking windows,
Hmm.
removing sharp objects, helping an individual maintain a regular sleep schedule can be really helpful. Also, reducing stress, as I mentioned. Some medications that I think are sometimes used, I think I could be wrong. The internet will, I'm sure, correct me, but Often antidepressants are sometimes used, which I'm still not fully clear on exactly why, but I do believe that they have been demonstrated for use here. The other thing is cognitive behavioral therapy has been shown to be effective. There was a paper by, I think it was Howell back in maybe 2010 that I remember, and they demonstrated that cognitive behavioral therapy was shown to be effective at lessening these in some individuals, but not in all individuals. So I would say overall, hopefully that's a good sort of synopsis. It's a complex sleep disorder. It can have some significant safety concerns and psychological implications for individuals and their family. We don't fully understand its causes. And I would say that the treatments are evolving, but most of those treatments are around just making things safe and trying to reduce the triggers. What else am I missing, Etty? I'm really trying to be much quicker now in terms of my responses so we get through more of these questions, but I hope it's not too much of a whirlwind tour that doesn't make sense. Tell me where I didn't make sense.
It's fascinating. And I think also sleepwalking as a phenomena is a bit like the polar opposite of lucid dreaming that we were talking about in a different AMA, where consciousness comes into a state that typically you're less aware of. And here, what we're getting is actually the opposite. There's some
Hmm.
behavior that only happens during wake, but then that conscious part is just removed. And it's a really great example of the continuous spectrum we have between sleep and consciousness, which I think is fascinating.
That's a great, I love the contrast in the paradox there. It really is a surprising, I think what we typically describe it as in neuroscience is a mixed state of consciousness
Hmm.
where you're neither fully awake, you're neither fully asleep. And in fact, when people are sleepwalking, when we've done sleep laboratory recordings and they get up, we can still see very clear, deep, slow wave brainwaves happening.
Hmm.
So their brain would tell us they are clearly having deep sleep, but their behavior tells us they look like they're clearly having wakefulness. And it's this very strange invasion of sleeping physiology into waking
Hmm.
behavioral activity, but not waking consciousness. Such a strange situation.
Yeah.
Anyway, maybe next question, and maybe we can start to draw things to a close. A partner of today's podcast is Shopify. Why Shopify? As someone who spends his days researching sleep and his nights researching sleep, the idea of selling merchandise was quite daunting. And you're probably thinking, what on earth is he going to be selling? We're going to start with some exciting t-shirts, all with the proceedings going directly to a new sleep education non-profit charity that I will announce later. At the moment that we started to do that, I knew what I wanted to design, but how on earth was I going to get this sleep merch into your fantastic hands? Everyone who gave me answers gave me the same answer, Shopify, and it turned out to be remarkably simple without any retail experience. I was able to set up and activate my store effortlessly. Shopify's point of sale system, it's really interesting. It basically just integrates perfectly with all of the different online sales components, and it just manages everything so smoothly. Honestly, it was great. Shopify POS, it handles all the complexities of sales, inventory, and it just lets me focus on my passion, which is sleep science. Try it out. You'll see what I mean about its intuitive platform. Oh, you should also note that Shopify isn't just for online businesses. I've heard, at least from one friend in particular, it really can help revolutionize in-person sales as well. It's one system that seems to integrate everything. If you would like an offer, here is the offer. Shopify have agreed to do a $1 per month trial. It's just $1 a month if you do shopify.com/Matt Walker. So again, shopify.com/Matt Walker. You'll get Shopify for $1 a month. That's nuts. I don't know why they're doing this for me, but it's great. Okay, let's get back to the show.
Okay, so the next question relates really nicely to what we discussed. It's treatment considerations for sporadic sleepwalking in children. And you mentioned that this is more prevalent in children. So, anything to add on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I do think there's probably a few more things that I should have pointed out for children. And it's the reason I often get asked this question is not because people are asking it regarding adults or their adult partner. It's usually because of their children. So I should probably go into it a little bit more detail. I described the higher prevalence, and there is. I would say, again, just to emphasize, children often grow out of their sleepwalking. I know that's no soothing commentary if your child is sleepwalking, just to sort of say, hang in there, it's going to get better, but it very much likely is. It usually just requires really careful management to ensure safety and address the underlying causes. So, let me start with some of the environmental safety things, and it touches back on what we mentioned there. But again, be sure that if your child is sleepwalking and starting to sleepwalk quite a lot, but even if they show it for one time, I would say be diligent about locking the doors and locking the windows, particularly the doors to the outside. You obviously don't want to be locking your child in their room necessarily, but if there is a door that you're going to lock, make sure it's a door that is giving access to the child outside. Same with windows. Make sure that you look around the bedroom and you think about sharp objects or sharp corners. And if your child is frequently sleepwalking, that's something to keep in mind. Some people consider, based on medical advice, the idea of using safety gates for staircases. So if you are living in a home where the bedrooms are upstairs and the child is sleepwalking, that can certainly be one of the things that you can proof or insurance proof safety by way of doing. So I would say those are certain environmental safety measures. In terms of preventative strategies, best one I could give you, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, is regularity. Maintain a regular sleep schedule and maintain adequate amounts of sleep in your child. I mean, that's just good advice in general. But if they are having frequent sleepwalking episodes, implementing those two things quite religiously has been demonstrated to reduce the frequency of sleepwalking events. And again, try to limit the number of times that they're going to be sleep deprived. And life happens. So there will be times when your child is sleep deprived. Just be a little bit more thoughtful that when they are sleep deprived, they are going to be at a higher probability risk of sleepwalking. Try to help them manage the stress. If your child is psychologically anxious or stressed, it's only going to make those matters worse. I think the other thing, which in part is why I wanted to focus on this question once again, most parents don't have any education on this. Sometimes they don't know what's happening. They just know sleepwalking is happening. They get very nervous. They get very anxious. Is this pathological? Does this mean that my child's brain is dysfunctional? None of those things are true. Just knowing that it is a thing that occurs with somewhat high frequency in children, something that's, 2, 3, 4% of the population. And you think of the population here in America, maybe it's 350 million individuals. You look at the number of children and you look at that percentage. That's a lot of children who are going to be affected. So, firstly, know that it's something that can be perfectly natural. It's something that can be managed. It doesn't require some marked medical intervention. It just needs to be thoughtful. And I think trying to alleviate those concerns is a huge thing. Just parent reassurance. And then knowing that this too shall pass, that it's not always going to be there and present. Most parents will worry about the moment, but they'll also sometimes sit and think, my goodness, this is going to be my child for the rest of their life. As adults, they're going to have to face this. What does that mean for their future happiness with a partner, etc.? Don't be stressing about that, because with age comes a reduction in frequency. I think all of these things are so critical for parents to understand. So I don't think there's too much else to say there, but I did want to bring those things up, particularly about thinking of gates on stairs
Yeah.
in the home. I didn't mention that before. And certainly not just being mindful of safety and security, but all outside doors. Just make, I'm sure most people will lock them, but some people live in areas where you don't have to necessarily, or you don't feel as though you need to. But if your child is doing that, you may want to implement that too. And then just knowing about this being not something that you should get so concerned about. Now, if it's happening frequently enough and your child is in danger enough, certainly go to a medical doctor and speak with them. And if you've just got any concerns at all, speak to a pediatrician. They should know plenty about this situation. But just keep in mind that it's not considered to be a particularly malignant condition in the sense of brain development going wrong,
Hmm.
nor is it something that will last for the entire child's life.
And Matt, any tips to how to approach the child, how to best kind of wake them up gently? Because they're probably pretty scared when they realize where they are and that they don't remember anything.
Very good question. Thank you for bringing that up. The best thing to try to do in terms of when it's happening is gently guiding the child back to bed without necessarily waking them up. That's often the recommendation. Because if you wake a child during a sleepwalking event very abruptly, they end up getting very confused, very disoriented, and very anxious. So, gradually, what you can do is just very gently guide the child back to bed and see if you can do that without waking them up. And then just letting them see if they can fall back asleep nice and gradually. And when that's happened, you can go back to bed.
That's wonderful.
Okay. Well, with that, we have wrapped up another AMA, Ask Me Anything. I will thank you, Etty, once again for being such a wonderful partner in crime. You make these things a sublime joy to do. And I know for the listeners, based on some of the comments, it is a sublime listening experience that is the perfect antidote to the unpleasant experience that is listening to me monologue. So thank you for joining, Etty.
Thank you for having me, Matt.
So we will see you in the next episode of these AMAs, and you will hear from me, unfortunately, in a monologue in another standard episode coming your way very soon. For now, take care, sleep well,